A question for you. Has this ever happened to you before? Students are about to do an activity, you've given them the instructions, you think it's really clear what they have to do, but then when you get started, it becomes apparent they haven't understood or that they start doing something completely different.
Oh, yeah, that has happened to me plenty of times. I think, especially when I was relatively new to teaching. What about you?
Oh, me too. Too many times to mention.
I'm Abby,
I'm Charlotte.
and you're listening to a My World of ELT podcast. And in this episode, we're going to be talking about our own experiences of getting into difficulty with those activity instructions.
So, Abby, when do you think this is most likely to happen?
I think there's a couple of situations when it happens a lot. So the first one is possibly when students think they know what they're supposed to do. So maybe they've glanced at the worksheet and it looks kind of familiar, or they think they've done something like this before, or they think they can guess what they have to do. And then in that situation, they just stop listening. They don't they don't even listen to the instructions. They've made loads and loads of assumptions.
That can very easily happen, can't it?
Oh yes, yeah, it happens. It happens a lot. And I think it also happens when you've got an activity that's got loads of different parts to it. So it might be right. First of all, you need to, with your partner, identify 6 examples of this. And then when you've done that, you need to match them to this. And then when you've done that, you have to put them into a sentence. I think when there's multiple parts, there's multiple opportunities for misunderstandings, basically.
Absolutely. And I think also as teachers, sometimes we're planning our activities and we don't necessarily know how difficult it's going to be for our students. So when we're in
It's
the
true.
classroom, we start reeling off these instructions and perhaps our students don't quite get what we want them to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what do you think tends to be the consequence of poor instructions?
Yeah, that's a good one because we can't just blame the students here. I think, yes, sometimes they jump to conclusions or they make assumptions or they rush through and they don't listen. But there are plenty of times where it might be that our instructions weren't clear enough. And that can lead to all sorts of problems. I mean, the most obvious one is wasted time and energy, because I think if we rush through those instructions and then they start doing it wrong, it just takes more time to correct that and go back and make sure that they've really got it. So time is often something we don't have. We're looking at the clock, we're trying to make sure we get through everything on our lesson plan. So that's something we could do without, I think, is having to re-explain.
I know what you mean. And the irony is I find that sometimes you're giving instructions quickly just to try and save time because you've planned this great activity and you really want to make sure you've got time to do the activity and in a meaningful way and have great feedback on it. But then your instructions are quite poor or too quick, or you haven't put enough thought into them. And like you said, you end up having to repeat them and going over them again and again and actually wasting a lot more time.
Yeah, it's a classic example of a false economy, isn't it? Quick
Yes,
instructions, we'll get on with it, and then it all ends up taking much longer than if you'd have just invested the time in the first place. And I think
absolutely.
the other thing in that situation when you're having to re-explain is that your teacher talk time is just increasing. The amount that the students are talking and doing is decreasing. Which is really not what we want. So, good intentions to get
Yeah.
on with the activity, but I think it needs to be a lot more clearly thought through to get the most out of it for everybody.
Yeah, agreed.
So, Charlotte, what about you? Have you ever got in a muddle with this before?
Oh, yeah, plenty of times. Probably too many times to mention. I think there's one particular time that really sticks out in my mind, though, and that's when I was a relatively new teacher, and it was actually an observed lesson. It makes me still nervous, just anxious, like talking about it again now. But I'd planned a really nice communicative activity. It took ages to plan, ages to prepare. It was a great activity to practice the language that I taught that lesson. And I gave out my instructions. I said, let's go. and I had lots of blank faces. Nobody stood up and started mingling, which is what I told them to do. I became immediately very flustered because I was being observed and it wasn't going to plan. And I think I said something like, "You need to get up. Come on, you need to get up and speak to each other." Which of course they did, but not in the meaningful way that I'd intended them to in order to complete the activity. And I just had all those things running through my mind. What should I do? Should I stop it and start again? Should I try and explain more? Should I let them just get on with it? Should I go around one by one and tell them where they're going wrong? And I must admit, on that lesson, I did give up a bit, and I thought it's the end of the lesson. I'll just let them get on with it, and I'll just work out later on where that went wrong.
I think being observed kind of adds to the stress
Oh,
of the whole situation as well, doesn't it?
absolutely.
I think there's times as well when I've got into trouble with my instructions when those activities where you've got right student A is going to be doing this and student
Mhm.
B is going to be doing that. So you almost have to give like you're almost having to give two sets of instructions and then you think, how do I do that? Do I tell everybody everything or do I
Yeah,
put them into groups and go over to each one? And are they going to get confused about which bit they're supposed to be doing and which bit their partner is supposed to be doing?
it's just a real minefield, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. And now with more experience, do you think you think about your instructions a little bit more in advance?
Oh, absolutely. It's now just a part of my planning, a part of my lesson planning. It's not even an afterthought anymore. It's something that I do as I plan my lesson, as I plan my activities. I think about what I'm going to say and how I'm going to give those instructions. And I think about where students might have difficulty in understanding that activity so that I can maybe preempt that, so that hopefully I'm not taken by surprise by lots of blank faces in the classroom.
Hindsight is a great thing, isn't it?
Yeah.
It can teach us a lot.
And what about you, Abby? Do you think more about your instructions now when you're planning?
Definitely. I think it's natural now to do it. It was something that I completely overlooked in the early days. I was concentrating so much on what the students were doing, not thinking too much about what I was doing or what I was saying. But yeah, it's definitely one of those things that is part of my thought process at the planning stage. And I think it gets easier when you've done certain activities before. You learn what works and what doesn't work, and when have students really kind of got it and when have they struggled. So you're fine tuning them as you go, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Abby, what advice would you give your trainee teachers to help them avoid these kinds of situations?
Well, I think we mentioned before that instructions often get overlooked at the planning stage.
Hmm.
I know that a lot of our trainee teachers practice their language presentation, for example, and then it becomes clear that they didn't really practice giving instructions. So that's something that we advise a lot, that we say just practice it, say it out loud. How does it sound? Record yourself. Would you be able to follow those instructions easily? Or test them on somebody else and see how they find them. So I think practice is quite a big thing, to remember that this is an important part of an effective activity, is getting the instructions right. Um, but also making sure that students have them in various forms. So maybe write them on the worksheet so they can see them, as well as giving them verbal instructions. And then maybe writing them on the board as well, or a couple of key points on the board so that they've got lots of different references, basically, to check that they've understood 100% what it is they're supposed to be doing. Anything that's broken down into steps is going to be much easier for students to understand. Too much in one go, there's lots of opportunity for overwhelm. So I think that's the other thing. Break it down, practice it, lots of different formats. Hopefully, you're good to go.
That's really great advice.
So, what about you? Do you have any other tips for those trainee teachers, Charlotte?
So, just following on from what you said, I would say to my trainees, always just reduce your instructions to their simplest form. Cut out any words or phrases that you don't need, and just remember that students are having to process language here as well as what to do with the activity. So just keep it as simple as possible. And as you mentioned, do an example or a demonstration, because they can be so much more effective than just describing what they have to do. And don't take anything for granted. Don't just assume, oh, this is an easy activity and they'll know how to do it.
Absolutely. I think that thing about language processing is really key. You know, we're teaching language, but the language they're being exposed to isn't just in the activities, it's in those instructions. And that can be quite demanding, you know, having to process and check and translate and make sure they've understood. So I think, you know, we can't underestimate how much is going on for our learners when they're trying to interpret those instructions.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in.
It is. If you would like to read some of our top tips on how to give instructions that students can more easily follow, click on the link for our free downloadable worksheet.
And if you're not familiar with My World of ELT, you might not know that what we love to do is give you some language solutions for these classroom problems. So if that's something you might be interested in, go to our website to check out our bite-sized modules, where you can learn some functional phrases and do some listening practice on a range of classroom-based topics.
Thanks for listening to this My World of ELT podcast, and see you next time.
Bye for now.